Fala, rapaziada, boa noite. Tudo bem? Bora ver um vídeo de filosofia. Eu gosto muito de filosofia, tá? Mas eu não sei se eu gosto de filosofia em inglês, eu nunca vi. Mas filosofia é legal, pensar é legal. E uma frase famosa do René Descartes: penso, logo existo. É essa frase. O vídeo de hoje vai ser sobre essa frase, tá? I think, therefore I am. Explain it. Do Alex O'Connor, ok? Penso, logo existo. A frase do René Descartes, o canal do Alex O'Connor.
Je pense donc je suis.
René Descartes era francês, tá? Então por isso que é Je pense donc Jesus, que é penso, logo existo.
Cogito ergo sum.
É porque ele tá falando em vários idiomas.
I think, therefore I am. One of the most, if not the most, famous statements in the history of philosophy. Yet, as with so many famous philosophical
Eu acho que é a mais famosa frase, tá? Tenho quase certeza. Uma das mais lendárias, né, velho?
aphorisms, the meaning of this phrase is often less familiar to people than the phrase itself. And so today, we're going to explore a little bit of the philosophy of Rene Descartes, who coined that phrase, and uncover what I think, therefore I am actually means. But even if you are already familiar with the meaning of this maxim, your interpretation will not be the only one that exists. For example, did you know that a number of respected scholars are of the opinion that I think, therefore I am is actually a mistranslation of Descartes that subtly obscures what he was really trying to express? More on that later. For now, I want to start at the basis of Descartes' philosophy to understand what he was actually trying to do when he stumbled upon this famous phrase.
O racionalista, racionalistas, os
Rene
racionalistas.
Descartes belonged to a school of philosophers known as the rationalists, which also famously included the thinkers Spinoza and Leibniz. These were men who believed that there is such thing as innate knowledge.
Esse Spinoza é aquele cara, o mesmo que tem a teoria de o Deus de Spinoza lá.
They believed that there is such a thing as a priori knowledge, which Immanuel Kant defined as knowledge that is absolutely independent of all experience. A priori literally means from what comes before. For rationalists, there are truths, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, perhaps, which can be known prior to any observation or experimentation. That is, we can come to knowledge through reason alone. For comparison, the great intellectual nemesis of rationalism is called empiricism. Empiricists believe that all of our knowledge ultimately arises from our sense perception, that is, from our observations of the outside world. David Hume is perhaps the most famous member of the empiricist school of thought, and he argued that, for example, the only reason you can have a concept of, say, a unicorn in your mind is because you've observed in the past, say, a horse, and you've observed horns, and you can put these together in your mind to create what Hume would call a complex idea. Complex ideas like that of a unicorn obviously don't arise directly from our observations of the world, but the simple ideas from which they're built, like a horn or a horse, can only be known about through what we've observed. Ultimately, all of our knowledge comes from the external world, and there is no innate knowledge, only that which we've learned through observation. Now, this kind of knowledge is called a posteriori knowledge, knowledge which comes from our sense data. And you can see that the words a priori and a posteriori contain prior and post, that is, before and after. A priori knowledge is knowledge that comes before any kind of observation or experimentation. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge that comes after experimentation and observation. And this is the key distinction between the rationalists and the empiricists. And when Descartes set out to write his most famous work, he was attempting to discover what kind of a priori knowledge might exist. What, if anything, can we know to be true beyond any doubt without having to rely on observations or experiments, which, after all, could be illusory or false? Can there be such a thing as philosophical certainty on any subject. To find out, we'll turn to that famous work called Meditations on First Philosophy to discover how Descartes got to I think therefore I am, or as the scholars like to call it, the cogito. Descartes begins his meditations by recognizing a problem of skepticism. How can we know that anything is true? How can you know that anything exists? After all, it's possible that your senses are deceiving you and the world is an illusion. It's possible that you're actually dreaming right now. Usually when we're dreaming, we're not aware that we're dreaming and think that we're having real experiences. So who's to say that this, or something like this, isn't happening right now? Well, to try to discover what we can know with certainty and avoid these kinds of doubts, Descartes therefore decides to take anything that it's even minutely possible to doubt and treat it as false. If it's possible to conceive of a belief being false, he treats it as if it is false, so that whatever's left over will only be that which we can know with certainty. This way, we can find a rock-solid intellectual foundation upon which we can hopefully build up our other beliefs. But this foundation must be something that it is impossible.
Esse vídeo tá mais difícil que o normal, tá? Filosofia, papai. Palavras antigas. Ok.
To doubt. Here Descartes introduces his famous evil demon. He writes, I will suppose, therefore, that some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colours, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely delusions of dreams, which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself not as having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all of these things. A modern equivalent of this thought experiment that's often used is that of being a brain in a vat. So if you don't like the evil demon that Descartes proposes, just imagine that instead you are a brain in a vat and all of your sense experiences are just illusions and that somebody's deceiving you that way instead. So, for argument's sake, Descartes says, it's all false. I don't have hands. I'm not sat in front of a camera. My memories aren't actually real. Descartes even doubts mathematical truths, saying that a powerful enough deceiver
Ah tá, é pra não acreditar nas memórias, que são tudo falso.
could make it such that, quote, I too go wrong every time I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square. I mean, it's possible, right? And remember, as long as it's possibly false, we're going to say that it is false, so that what's left over is what we can know beyond doubt. So this is where Descartes ends the first meditation, by taking all of the beliefs that he can possibly doubt and acting as if they're false. So serious are the doubts into which I have been thrown as a result of yesterday's meditation that I can neither put them out of my mind nor see any way of resolving them. It feels as if I have fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand on the bottom nor swim to the top. So that's where we're up to, kids. Quite a miserable condition, I think you'll agree. But it's here, in the
Tristeza, velho.
second meditation, that Descartes finally finds a ground for his feet. Descartes asks, if my hands don't exist, nor the world, nor my memories, etc., does it follow that I do not exist? No. I must exist in some form. Maybe I don't exist as Alex O'Connor, a male Homo sapiens with hands and feet and a need for a haircut, but I must exist in some form. How can I know this? Well, because even if I'm being deceived entirely by an evil demon or by somebody controlling my brain in a vat, there must be a me to be deceived. I can't
Entendi. A ideia é tipo assim, eu posso existir não nessa realidade, não como Mario, não como um ser humano, um Homo sapiens que tá falando aqui com você. A ideia de eu existir, pode ser que isso aqui seja tudo só memórias, só um truque. E aí, penso, logo existo. Eu existo, só que não precisa ser isso aqui. Esse papinho aqui, nós dois aqui, pá. Deu pra entender? Se não entendeu também, vê o vídeo. Tá doido? Tem que explicar tudo pra vocês também.
Deny my own existence, because if I denied that I existed, who's doing the denying? An evil demon can convince me of all kinds of falsities, but it can't convince me that I don't exist, because there needs to be a me to be convinced of this. Remember, Descartes' method is to take anything that can be doubted and treat it as false. But doubting whether or not I'm thinking is a special case, because doubting is a kind of thinking. Since doubting is a kind of thinking, by doubting that I'm thinking, I automatically prove that I am thinking, because the very act of doubting is an act of thinking. It would be impossible to doubt that I'm thinking, because this would amount to thinking that I'm not thinking, which is a contradiction in terms. And so, as long as I am doing some thinking, well, I am. I am thinking simply contains I am. And as soon as Descartes even begins to doubt everything that he can, he's already thinking, since to doubt is to think. And so as long as I'm doing some kind of thinking, I can know that I exist, at least in some form. That is to say, I think, therefore I am. That exact phrase, I think, therefore I am, doesn't actually appear in the Meditations, but Descartes uses other words to express exactly the same point. He writes of the evil demon, "Let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I think that I am something." So, after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. That is, whenever I am thinking, I am. Now, there's a lot to be said about this and whether Descartes is actually correct, but at the very least, this should explain what Descartes meant when he wrote the Cogito, and, more to the point, why this is the first thing that he addresses in the Meditations. Simple as it may seem, Descartes now thinks he's established something undeniable, something immune to doubt, and so, hopefully, something that we can begin building the rest of our worldview upon. But as I say, there's still a lot more to discuss about the Cogito.
Dedução ou intuição?
I think, therefore I am, sounds a lot like a deduction. It sounds like we have one statement, I think, from which we deduce a conclusion.
Eu vou decorar aí. I think, therefore I am. 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 Pronto, já decorei. I think, therefore I am.
Conclusion. I am. It seems like Descartes is offering an argument here, then. That is, a statement of premises and a conclusion that's deduced from it. But there's a debate in the literature about whether Descartes intended to present the Cogito as an argument, or rather as a singular intuition. To get to grips with this debate, let me first define an important term. A syllogism is an argument that takes the form of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, John Cottingham, in his wonderful commentary on
Eu já estudei isso aí. Não lembro da onde.
Descartes, writes that we could understand the Cogito to be a form of syllogism, which would look something like this. Premise 1, whatever is thinking exists. Premise 2, I am thinking. Conclusion, therefore, I exist. This argument is valid, which means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. And this is how logical argument is usually done. It's natural for us to try to syllogize Descartes in this way. We're used to thinking of logical validity as occurring when you have a set of premises and a conclusion that follows from them. But Descartes himself responded to this when replying to objections to the Meditations, writing the following. When someone says, I am thinking, therefore I am, or I exist, he does not deduce existence from thought by means of a syllogism, but recognizes it as something self-evident by a simple intuition of the mind. That is to say, coming to know that I exist isn't a process of deductive reasoning like you find in a syllogism, but rather a single, unified, instantaneous intuition that I only know to be true while I'm thinking about it. The philosopher Peter Markey writes that intuition is distinguished from deduction by the fact that it does not involve a movement of thought through a series of inferences, and by its immediate self-evidence. And the passage from Descartes that I just quoted seems to very heavily imply that Descartes is thinking of the cogito in the sense of an intuition, rather than the sense of deduction. But it's never quite
Peraí, rapidinho que eu vou pausar, só tem que pegar uma água. Viu só? Não passe demais que eu já peguei minha aguinha. Bebam água, gente. Muito bom.
that simple, of course, in philosophy, because in 1648, Franz Berman interviewed Descartes and pressed him on this question of whether the cogito is syllogistic. And Descartes responded by admitting that a major premise may be, quote, implicitly presupposed when I arrive at the knowledge of my own existence. But Descartes is clear in saying that the person doing the thinking is not explicitly aware of the presence of such a premise. It's a strange thing to say, given what we've already heard, but this is why, despite Descartes insisting himself that the cogito is a mere intuition, there is still some debate about whether he was really presenting something like a disguised syllogism. John Cottingham is of the opinion that we should interpret Descartes as presenting an intuition, not a syllogism, and for what it's worth, I agree with him. We seem to arrive at the cogito as a singular intuition based on this special relationship between doubt and thought. As I said earlier, doubting is a kind of thinking, and so to doubt that one is thinking is to automatically rid oneself of that doubt. It's simply the case that I am thinking contains I am. It all just happens at once. So that, to me, says that we should be interpreting Descartes as presenting a singular intuition here. John Cottingham writes that, quote, most logicians are accustomed to thinking of validity predominantly in terms of timeless, non-tensed propositions. But we should rid ourselves of this temptation and understand that the cogito is only thought to be guaranteed as true when it is being thought. It's the act of doubting that confirms that I exist, not the timeless fact that I am a being that doubts things. It's only when I'm doing the thinking, doing the doubting, that I can know that I exist. Otherwise, for example, I'd have to rely on my memories. Perhaps at one point, I established that I existed because I was thinking, and now I'm not doing that doubting itself, I just remember that I established that, and so I know that I exist. Well, my memories could be false, they could be illusory. I can doubt that my memories are giving me an accurate representation of what happened in the past. So I can't rely on having done the doubting already to know that I exist. I have to be doing the doubting right now in order to establish that I exist. For this reason, the fact that the cogito can only be known to be true when I'm thinking, John Cottingham thinks that I think therefore I am is a misleading translation of what Descartes had to say. Since
Perdeu na
Descartes was
tradução.
French, the cogito first appears in French in Descartes' Discourse on the Method as Je pense donc je suis. Later, he wrote the same thing in his Principles of Philosophy, which this time was written in Latin, and so there we find the more famous formulation, cogito ergo sum. Descartes never wrote in English, and traditionally the phrase has been simply translated as cogito, I think, ergo, therefore, sum, I am. I think, therefore I am. But keep in mind that the cogito is likely not supposed to be a timeless deduction, but something that we can only know to be true when we're reflecting upon it. Descartes notices himself that he could falsely remember having been convinced of something. I can only be certain of the truth of the cogito when I think about it. For this reason, Cottingham writes, the correct English translation should imply
Agora eu entendi o tanto de cogito que ele fica falando aí. É porque é no latim, né? No latim. I think therefore I am.
the so-called continuous present, I am thinking, rather than the simple present, I think. For what makes me certain of my existence is not some static or timeless fact about me, that I am one who thinks. Rather, it is the fact that I am at this moment engaged in thinking. So,
Mano, só o fato de você estar pensando. Só o fato de você estar vendo esse vídeo falando, caralho, que maluco doido esse aí, barbuda, careca. É. Só o fato de você estar pensando, já... Você existe. É isso. É a consciência. I think therefore I am, pô.
If John Cottingham is right that Descartes' cogito should be interpreted as an intuition rather than the presentation of a timeless syllogism, then cogito ergo sum is best translated not as I think therefore I am, but I am thinking therefore I am, or I am thinking therefore I exist. Now this may seem like a pedantic and useless distinction, but when you consider this debate about the syllogistic versus
Tá, então ele trocaria a frase, em vez de I think therefore I am, que no português é eu penso, logo existo, seria I thinking therefore I am. Eu estou pensando, I think therefore I am.
the intuitive interpretation of Descartes, you realize that this subtle distinction really does make all the difference when trying to interpret Descartes in the English language. To say, I think, therefore I am, implies this kind of timelessness about the truth of the cogito, that it's true timelessly, tenselessly, that's much more characteristic of syllogistic deductive reasoning. Whereas to say, I am thinking, therefore I exist, is more like an act. It lends itself much more to the intuitive interpretation of Descartes and the claim that it's only true, the cogito's truth can only be guaranteed when you're doing the thinking. I think, therefore I am, versus I am thinking, therefore I am. So for this reason, when I'm discussing Descartes, I prefer to translate the cogito as I am thinking, therefore I exist.
Estou pensando.
But look, if you're somebody who prefers the syllogistic deductive interpretation of the cogito, you might prefer to still use I think, therefore I am, the more famous formulation. It's really up to you. Of course, the best thing that you can probably do is learn French and go and read the meditations in their original language, but to be honest with you, I struggle enough to understand Descartes in the English language, so good luck to you if that's the task you choose. A final thing that I want to note is this. The cogito is special for Descartes because it is impossible to doubt, and it's this that allows it to serve, in his view, as the bedrock of his philosophy. But something being immune to doubt is not, in my view, quite the same thing as it being true. Consider an example from Baron Reed, who asks us to imagine a mother who may be psychologically incapable of giving up the belief that her son did not commit a gruesome murder. Or imagine somebody whose brain is literally wired so as to make it impossible for them to doubt that the son is innocent. It seems that the fact that for this person it's impossible to doubt something isn't the same thing as saying that thing is true. For this reason, we might want to make a subtle distinction and say that the real success of the meditations is not so much in establishing truth, but rather establishing psychological certainty, or discovering what it's impossible to doubt. But it's clear that Descartes himself thought that certainty does confer truth. In his third meditation, he describes his inability to doubt his existence as, quote, the first item of knowledge. He also earlier wrote in the second meditation that I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. So Descartes certainly seems to think that an inability to doubt a proposition is evidence enough that that proposition is true. But I just wanted to flag
Esse vídeo já tava uns quase 2 meses na minha playlist aqui pra assistir. E eu não achei nenhum vídeo pra assistir. Então eu coloquei ele.
that this might not actually be true. And again, there's a lot more to be said about this.
Lógico que é um vídeo mais difícil que os outros, tá? Eu sei disso. Mas vamos treinar nossa audição e é isso aí.
And there's a whole discussion to be had around Descartes' criterion for what makes something true or certain. And if you want to learn more about that, well, perhaps I'll make a video in the future, or I would recommend reading John Cottingham's book. I'm going to leave a list of recommended reading for Descartes in the description if you're interested in reading more. But just bear in mind that there's a lot more going on with the cogito than first meets the eye. As I say, whether being unable to doubt something entails that that something is true is a discussion for another time, but I hope that this preliminary overview of the cogito demonstrates that it may well be a lot more complicated and contentious than it appears to be at first. Descartes spends the rest of the meditations trying to prove mind-body dualism and the existence of God, among other things, but it all begins here with the cogito. And so I hope that this can serve as a useful introduction to Descartes, if nothing else. I do hope that you've got something out of this video, even if just the ability to go, well, actually, that's probably not an accurate translation of Descartes. It's great fun to do that at parties. I'll leave some use.
Acabou o vídeo, ele só tá se explicando agora. Mano, deu pra entender a ideia, tá? A frase, I think therefore I am, penso logo eu existo. Se eu sou um ser pensante, eu existo. Talvez os meus pensamentos, minhas lembranças são mentirosas. Igual ele deu o exemplo lá, o cara pensou no cavalo, depois pensou no chifre, depois imaginou um cavalo com chifre e unicórnio. Beleza. Não que o unicórnio exista. Mas, se eu penso nisso, eu existo. Fé nas malucas, tá? Não sei se você entendeu esse vídeo. Teve muita coisa que eu não entendi, tá? Mas é isso, cara. Temos que nos desafiar. Se ficar vendo conteúdo fácil também não vai virar a chavinha do meu conhecimento. Então eu tenho que ver umas coisas doidas assim também. Beleza? Tá comigo?